Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching How Did Islam Become a Global Religion by Epic History. Now we recently watched their video on how Christianity became a global religion, and now we get to Islam, the two biggest religions around the world today. Now, we've actually done a fair amount of content on the early history of Islam, for example, Kings and Generals series on early Muslim expansion, so I do know a bit, especially about the early caliphate and its expansion, but of course, there's a lot of history I still don't know in relation to Islam. So this will be a really fascinating video. If you guys end up enjoying this one, I'd appreciate it if you'd leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon, which is linked down below. Now, with all of that out of the way, let's jump right into this reaction.
Islam, the second most practiced religion on earth, emerges in the 7th century from what many at the time consider a backwater, the desert region of Arabia.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Islam emerges really on the borders of these two great empires. The Eastern Roman Empire, which has declined from its heights, but is still a very powerful empire in the region, and the Sassanids, aka the Persians, another of these great empires of history. Islam emerges right along the border here, right? In a region that was not necessarily central to either of these. And this is pretty important to the development of early Islam. Of course, the people and the culture of Arabia is very important to the early history of the religion itself. And so it's always interesting to see when we look at global religions or ideologies or beliefs, where do they emerge and how does that shape the evolution of a belief system?
The founder of Islam is Muhammad, a merchant born around 570 in the city of Mecca. In about 610, in the cave of Hira, he receives a series of revelations from the angel Jibreel, known in English as Gabriel. These revelations later become the basis of the holy book known as the Quran.
Yeah, and of course, when we look at our three Abrahamic religions, aka Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, I know there's been a lot of, you could say, conflict between believers of each religion throughout history, but these religions really have a lot more in common than they do difference, right? If you compare them to other popular religions, these religions draw on a lot of the same texts, a lot of the same stories. They share a lot of similar figures and characters throughout these three different religions. And there's a reason these are the three Abrahamic religions, the three religions of the book. And so, though I'm sure we'll see even in this video some conflict, especially between a lot of Christians and Muslims over time, there's a lot binding these three religions together. Now, of course, I'll say, I'm looking at this from an outside perspective, right? This is a secular take. I know some of you watching, of course, have a religious stake or your faith is wrapped up in this. For me, I'm viewing it through a secular lens, just looking at the history of these different religions. So, of course, your perspective on all of this is going to shape how you interpret the history, and I understand that. That's totally fine. Just telling you what my perspective is on this.
The spiritual truth of Muhammad's message is a matter of faith. But his life and the impact of his message are to have profound historical significance.
Oh, yeah.
At first, Muhammad preaches privately to a select group of family and friends in Mecca.
Yeah, and this is where, of course, if you're looking at it from a secular angle versus a religious one, there are going to be differences in how you interpret the history and what you believe, especially about the early days of any type of religion. I will say, though, we of course know a bit about the history of Muhammad himself, similar to someone like Jesus Christ, someone who we know a bit of the history, but there's a lot of belief around him. But I do think we know a lot more about the life of Muhammad in a historical sense than we do about the life of Jesus, right? In terms of the historicity of Jesus, we know he was a real guy, but there's a lot that's missing to that story. And a lot of people fill that in with faith and the Bible. Whereas Muhammad, I think we know a lot more about the details of his life in a sort of secular historical sense.
His message centers on the oneness of God, The need.
Which, I mean, might have been because, I'd say during his lifetime, Jesus remained relatively unknown. Now, of course, he'd become incredibly known after his lifetime. Whereas Muhammad, he's someone who's actually very important in this region in a sort of political sense, even during his lifetime.
His message centers on the oneness of God, the need for moral reform, and the concept of Islam, submission to God. In time, the followers of this new faith will be known as Muslims. Muhammad then begins to preach in public and gains loyal followers known as the Sahaba. Muhammad's preaching brings him into conflict with members of his own tribe, the Quraysh. The two sides are soon in open war. Around this time, the concept of jihad begins to take shape. Jihad comes to have two meanings. The first, to strive to live in accordance with God's will, through personal effort and moral integrity. The second, physical acts of war, sanctioned by God.
I also think it's interesting to look at the early days of these religions, where the early days of something like Christianity, I'm going to be making comparisons, both because, just to make the point, we just watched Epic History's video on Christianity, and because these religions are really more similar than they are different, in my opinion. Compared to other religions, at least, right? The early days of Christianity, it was a pretty underground religion, largely contained among those lower on the social hierarchy within the Roman Empire, and over hundreds of years it became more popular, and then was eventually taken up as the religion of the empire. With Islam, really from the beginning, it is wrapped up in empire and conquest, and we'll see, of course, unlike with Christianity, where it's adopted by the Roman Empire really hundreds of years into its life cycle, with Islam, the caliphate, right, this sort of empire is going to emerge almost instantaneously, essentially, pretty rapidly, right? So it's interesting to see some of that difference.
After years of conflict with the Quraysh, Muhammad and his followers prevail.
And that difference is, of course, based on the different circumstances each religion came up in, right? Whereas Christianity was within a Roman Empire that was, in some ways, relatively tolerant to other beliefs, though, of course, they would not be very tolerant towards Christians. That came up in a different way than Islam did out in Arabia.
And by Muhammad's death in 632, much of Arabia has joined the movement he founded. One of Muhammad's closest companions, Abu Bakr, is chosen as the first caliph, or successor to the Prophet.
There we go.
It is under his leadership and that of his successors that Islam will erupt out of Arabia to transform the Middle East and beyond.
Yeah, and you gotta give Abu Bakr a shout out, because he was quite the leader, military and otherwise himself. The Caliphate.
Abu Bakr and his successor Omar send Arab armies to attack the two great powers of the age, the Sasanian Empire and Eastern Roman Empire. Both are worn down by decades of conflict against each other.
Yeah, and this is a really important moment in the history of Islam. When we talk about, why did Islam become, one of the biggest religions around the world? May one day be the biggest. I believe it's still number 2 right now. There are a lot of religions that pop up, and then maybe they don't grow, right? They face some sort of challenge, they fall flat, they remain contained. Why did Islam spread so wide and far? And I really think there's a real important moment right here where it begins to expand outside of its place of origin, and really the two things standing in its way are the Romans and the Persians. Unfortunately for those two, they have just spent years pounding each other into the ground. The Romans and Persians were locked into this civil war with each other, where they really almost destroyed each other. The Roman Empire was brought to its knees, only to be saved by Heraclius, who then brings the Sassanids to their knees, right? So these two great empires have been greatly weakened by each other. And that leaves an opening for perhaps a new state in the region, maybe the Caliphate. This allows the Caliphate to expand extremely rapidly, right? I think a lot more rapidly than would have been the case had the Persians and the Romans been on more sure footing at that time.
And Arab armies strike like a thunderbolt. One by one, the great cities of the Levant, Syria, Egypt, and Persia fall to Muslim forces.
Yeah, I mean, the Persian Empire is just destroyed, right? The Sassanid Empire, already on its knees, crumbles, falls apart, is conquered by the Caliphate. Now, the Roman Empire survives, but in a greatly weakened state, having lost essentially all of its North African and Middle Eastern territory, and it will lose more of that territory over time. And that's, of course, a pretty big blow to the Christian Roman Empire, because they have just lost a lot of their most important religious sites out in the Holy Land, right? So a bad time for the Romans.
The people who live in these lands are predominantly a mix of Christians, Jews, and Zoroastrians. These non-believers are treated as subjects by their new Arab rulers and pay taxes to them, but they can worship freely.
And we'll see over time something. Now, look, there have been a lot of different Muslim states, empires, countries throughout history. Same thing with Christian countries. And so it's sort of hard to generalize on how they treat different religions, because you'll find different cases. But what I'll say, and I think generally holds up, is that these Muslim states throughout history tended to treat Christians and Jews with relative tolerance, at least compared to other religions, because they were these Abrahamic religions. And so typically, they were forced to pay more taxes, maybe forced to perform military service, usually were second-class citizens, but often were allowed to practice and were allowed to remain with their religions. That was not always the case with other non-Abrahamic religions. Now, once again, this very much depends on when and where you're looking at. There are exceptions all around, but just as a sort of very broad general statement.
There are few forced conversions and little active preaching of Islam, and so the religion spreads slowly at first. Until now, the Quran has been primarily an oral tradition, supported by various written compilations.
Yeah, and of course, still, I mean, I don't know that much about Muslim education, but I know in some places, still a big part of like an Islamic education is to memorize the Quran in its entirety and be able to speak it orally, right? So I know oral, repetition of the Quran is still something important to some Islamic education today, though of course now there's a big focus on also reading as well.
The exact circumstances are not clear, but during the reign of Caliph Uthman, the Quran is organized into a single text.
Like, for example, I know this is sort of a strange thing to think of, and it's totally sort of out of left field, but when you fast forward into the 1800s, and you have people taken from Africa as slaves, one of the way some of these slaves, or these enslaved people, would prove that they were educated is that they had an Islamic education, and they were able to recite the Quran, and they had some of this religious education, right? And sometimes that didn't matter, but there are cases where that led some people on the path towards freedom if they could prove they were educated. So just that's what my mind thought of when thinking of that type of oral education in regards to the Quran.
This remains the basis for the holy book used around the world today. In 656, Uthman is murdered. The Prophet's cousin and son-in-law, Ali, is elected the new caliph. But others support Uthman's cousin, the governor of Syria, Muawiyah. This conflict triggers Islam's first fitna, or civil war.
Yeah.
It is the root of the later division, between Shiite and Sunni Muslims.
And it's interesting, we see this religious split deepen over time, but like a lot of religious splits, there's a political element from the beginning. In fact, and I know people who are believers view it, of course, as a religious split, but as far as I can tell, it really was a political disagreement or a political split that sort of more evolved into a religious split over time, right? And I think that's the case with a lot of religious splits around the world, as there is oftentimes a more political basis that sometimes gets sort of forgotten as ideology gets infused over time.
Shia, from Shiat Ali, the party of Ali. Sunni, from Allah Sunnah, the people of the Prophet's way. In 661, Ali is assassinated by a group who become known as the Khawarij.
I will say though, hey, you know you're a real religion when you have your first big split, right? Every big religion goes through many splits over time.
The Umayyad dynasty seized power, moving the capital of the caliphate to Damascus. In 680, a rebellion by Ali's son Hussein ends at Karbala, when he and his small band of followers are massacred by Umayyad forces. It is a key moment in the transformation of Shi'ism from political movement to a distinct branch of Islam.
Right, exactly.
Shias will look to the leadership of Muhammad's direct descendants. Sunnis will look back to the time of the Prophet and his companions.
Yep. As we see, it becomes this very religious split as it evolves over time.
The Islamic world, riven by warring factions, plunges into a second fitna. But after 12 years of civil war and turmoil, great new conquests will follow.
Oh yeah. The Umayyads.
By 692, the Umayyads regain control of the Islamic Caliphate and resume their conquest of North Africa.
Really, this expansion is crazy. I mean, look at how much territory is already controlled. In the short span of time we've already seen, it is extremely rapid expansion.
Islam spreads quickly among the Berber tribes. And it is a Berber convert, Tariq, who leads Umayyad forces into Iberia. En route, he gives his name to Jabal Tariq, the Rock of Gibraltar.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that.
He defeats the Visigoth king, Roderick, and goes on to conquer much of Spain.
And of course, this is the first real Muslim entrance into Europe, right? We'll see over time, of course, when we look at the Ottomans in the east, there's a big Islamic presence in the Balkans. There'll be some around the Mediterranean as well, Sicily, other places. This is the first real big entrance into Europe here we see in Iberia.
The Umayyad Empire now stretches from the Atlantic coast to modern Pakistan.
Wow.
Most of its population remains non-Muslim. But there are now a growing number of converts across North Africa, Persia, and Central Asia, known as Mawali.
Well, it's the sort of like pragmatic imperial approach to this sort of thing, where yes, you could behave as a state where you expand and forcefully convert everyone you come across, but that makes expansion a lot more difficult, right? It's going to be hard to expand as far as the caliphate did if you're behaving like that. And you see this with a lot of big empires, they expand, they conquer a bunch of new peoples with a bunch of different religions, and what happens is over time, there will be conversion, because people find that converting is a way to raise their social status, move through the ranks, they'd rather not be a second-class citizen, and so the benefits of conversion present themselves to people over time. And slowly, your population, which may not have been that Muslim in the first place, becomes more and more Muslim over the years.
They are treated as inferiors by the Arab elite,
Yeah, you gotta
stoking
split.
resentment. And in 747, rebellion erupts in Khorasan.
Yeah.
The Abbasid family, claiming descent from the Prophet's uncle Abbas, claim leadership of this revolt.
Yeah, because these new converts, right, the whole idea, or how the empire's been functioning, is that, you're a Muslim, or you're a non-Muslim, and in which case you're allowed to practice, but you're a second-class citizen, you gotta pay more taxes, all that type of stuff. And so people, like I was saying, convert to Islam, either because they genuinely find the faith, or oftentimes because it's good for them personally. And so the whole idea is you convert, you're a Muslim, you should be treated just as well as any other Muslim. But these new converts find they are not being treated that way. There's a bit of an ethnic dimension. They feel like, hey, wait a minute, why are we still being treated badly? This isn't fair. And so that leads to this revolt or revolution here.
In 750, they defeat the Umayyads at the Zab River. Then systematically wipe out almost the entire dynasty. Only one Umayyad prince, Abd al-Rahman, escapes to Al-Andalus, where he establishes the independent emirate of Cordoba.
Yep, which is so crazy. Now you've got your own thing going on out in Iberia, which of course is still part of the Muslim world, but is now sort of separated from the rest.
In 756.
The Golden Age, yeah, under the Abbasids, the height of the Caliphate.
The Abbasids build a new capital, Baghdad, which
And this is really the height of the Caliphate, right? Its furthest extent, the amount of territory it controls, becomes increasingly prosperous. There's a lot of wealth, a lot of education, learning, a real cultural golden age as well.
The Abbasids build a new capital, Baghdad,
Yeah.
which becomes a great center of learning.
Yeah. Of course, any good golden age needs its center. In this case, that center is Baghdad.
This is the dawn of what is often called Islam's Golden Age, with remarkable advances in mathematics,
Yeah.
astronomy, medicine, and engineering. Shi'ism, now a fully distinct branch of Islam, continues to spread across the Caliphate, despite sporadic repression by its Sunni rulers.
Yeah, and so now it really is. It's a religious difference, right? Continues to spread, like I said, sporadic repression, but it's still existing within the empire. Now, of course, when we look at the world today, what we see in the Middle East is we have some Sunni states, some Shia states. Now, that does not mean that the majority, or sorry, I should say, that doesn't mean everybody in those states is necessarily Sunni or Shia. Of course, you've got a mix in there. But you do have states that are characterized by their majority adherence to a particular branch of Islam, right? But the case here is we have both of these different branches existing within the caliphate, though of course one is more accepted than the other.
Sects emerge within Shi'ism, including Twelver Shi'ism, Ismaili Shi'ism, and Zaidi Shi'ism. Sufi movements, which focus on inner spirituality and detachment from worldly distractions, also emerge in this period, though their early history is uncertain.
And so, like other religions, now Islam, we're decently into the life of Islam. By that I mean it's been a while since it first emerged, so you start this real era of learning and education, right? So what you see along with that is a lot of religious thinking, a lot of religious writing, different branches, different sects emerging, Sufism, people getting a little more sort of mystical with it, people taking different approaches to the religion, right? You see a real flourishing of that in this time period, which, is really what you see with the Golden Age, right? In any particular culture or religion, you see a flourishing of all different types of ideas, though they may be centered in one or more particular areas.
By the 900s, much of Persia, Egypt, and Syria has turned to Islam. There are practical as well as spiritual benefits from becoming Muslim.
Exactly. Practical and spiritual benefits, right?
Adopting the faith of the ruling elite offers advantages in business, networking, and status. But these regions still remain religiously diverse, with large Christian and Jewish communities, as well as several smaller sects. For many...
And you'll note they did not say large Zoroastrian communities. Now, there are some Zoroastrians today, but not very many anymore. And I don't know when that Zoroastrianism really went on the decline, but over time, like I was saying, the religions of the book, Judaism and Christianity, survive with a lot more temerity in these regions than do other religions like Zoroastrianism, right? I mean, you look at the region, you look at Persia over time, it becomes vast majority Muslim, right? Whereas a lot of these places are a lot more diverse, where a lot of Jews and Christians remained for a long time after the beginning of the Caliphate, right? And I do think a big part of that, once again, is the relationship between these three Abrahamic religions. You know, how Islam viewed their two sort of religions of the book, right? Judaism and Christianity, how they viewed them a little differently than they did other unrelated religions.
Years, Muslim traders have been crossing the semi-arid region known as the Sahel into sub-Saharan Africa. Among their purchases, enslaved Africans to be sold across the Caliphate. Following these trade routes, Islam gradually spreads south. In time, as rulers and elites adopt Islam, cities like Timbuktu, Gao, and Kano will become centers of Islamic learning and culture.
Yeah.
Muslim merchants also crossed the Arabian Sea and established trading hubs along the East African coast in modern Kenya, Tanzania, and Zanzibar.
I mean, it's fascinating that you can really see in wherever Islam spreads, basically different routes of travel and trade, right? So, of course, over time and today, right, a lot of North Africa is Muslim today, and then you look around and there are certain pockets or regions that are, a lot more Muslim, or you see a lot more Islam than other places throughout Africa. And what that highlights is just the different trade routes people were taking, right? And the different routes of travel people were taking. So it's fascinating that in the spread of this religion, this ideology, in that you can see the very practical realities of global trade, communication, commerce, connection.
These ports become centers of commerce, connecting East Africa to a wider Indian Ocean trading zone. Such complex, long-range commercial networks, of which the famous Silk Roads are also part, help Islam to spread deeper into Central, South, and Southeast Asia.
Yeah, this is where you see the beginning of Islam spreading through Asia. And of course, you've got connections between the Tang Empire, the Chinese in the east, their trade routes, the goods, and of course the Caliphate out in the west. And you really see over time that oftentimes these Muslim empires, the Caliphate in this case, would serve as a way to purchase and transport a lot of these goods from the east, either buying them for themselves or then trading them further west throughout, say, Europe and other places. The Seljuks. Here come the Turks.
In Central Asia, a semi-nomadic Turkic tribe called the Seljuks converts to Islam under the guidance of their leader, Seljuk Beg. The Seljuks carve out their own empire across the Middle East, conquering city after city. In 1055, they capture Baghdad, becoming de facto rulers of the Islamic Caliphate. Under the Seljuks, Islamic political power and religious authority are separated. Seljuk sultans hold military and political power. Religious leadership is provided by the caliphs and Islamic scholars known as ulama.
And what we see here is really the beginning of a sort of fracturing of the Islamic world, where it's been pretty united under the caliphate, not entirely, as we've seen, but united under this one empire. And under the empire, as they said, religious and political authority has been one. But now we see a time where authority, the state, is beginning to split. Soon we'll see the rise of a bunch of different Muslim states and empires and entities, and a time where religious and political authority, as they mentioned, is also splitting, where it's no longer you've got one guy who's both your sort of political and religious leader. Well, now you might have those separated, or you might have this religious community of scholars to look up to, and then a separate political leader, which of course can lead to conflicts over time. So we see this process really happening over time.
In 1071, Seljuk Sultan Alp Arslan defeats the Byzantine Empire at Manzikert.
Very consequential battle. This is when we see the Seljuks really begin to spread to their furthest extent westwards, heading into Byzantine Anatolia, which up until this point, the Romans had managed to defend roughly against incursions. Well, no longer. They're now losing that too.
Paving the way for Muslim conquest of Anatolia. But Christendom strikes back. Pope Urban calls for a holy war to liberate the Holy Land. And in 1099, Crusaders storm Jerusalem. Crusader states are established in the region, but remain areas of mixed faith. It is a period of political fragmentation in the Muslim world.
Yup, exactly what I was saying. And we see these Crusader states established. Now, as we know, those areas are not majority Christian today, right? So obviously they did not achieve at least one of the goals, which was to sort of reestablish continual Christian control, but they do establish political control for a certain period of time. This leads to some pretty major changes in the region, and there is still a fair amount of religious diversity in these areas, particularly in the Levant.
Much of the old empire is now ruled by regional dynasties and sects. Seljuks, Ghaznavids, Almoravids, and Fatimids. But in the 12th century, a Kurdish general known as Saladin succeeds in uniting Egypt,
He's pretty good.
Syria, and Iraq. In 1187, he recaptures Jerusalem, a prestigious victory for Saladin, and a turning point in the war against the Crusaders.
Yeah, I mean, he's a real military hero of this era, a pretty impressive fellow.
Since the 8th century, Muslim merchants and Sufi mystics have traveled the Silk Roads, deep into Central and Eastern Asia. The number of converts to Islam grows steadily. Among them, Berk Khan, grandson of Mongol conqueror Genghis Khan. Berk is said to have encountered a caravan of Muslim merchants at Bukhara and been persuaded by their piety. For now, most Mongols remain loyal to their animist beliefs. In 1258, Berk's cousin Hulagu launches a devastating campaign against Muslim lands that leads to the destruction of Baghdad.
And when they say devastating, they mean devastating, right? And now look, wherever the Mongols invaded, it was pretty devastating. But we see here a real destruction of a lot of Muslim cities, territory, a lot of death, of course. Baghdad is never the same after this. It's sacked. A lot of it is destroyed. I mean, once again, devastating is the right word. This is truly a very tough moment for a lot of these Islamic cities and states in this region.
and execution of the Caliph. But with time, Muslim faith and culture will conquer the Mongols. Within a century, 3 of the largest Mongol Khanates, from Russia to India, take Islam as their new religion.
Yeah, I mean, the Muslim world takes a real military beating from the Mongols, but I suppose they've got the longer sort of cultural victory, whereas they said, a lot of these really important successor Mongol states convert to Islam.
In Southeast Asia, centuries of contact with Muslim traders is also accelerating the spread of Islam.
And I will say, this is definitely what I know a lot less about, is the spread of Islam really throughout Asia, especially throughout South and East Asia. You know, I think perhaps because it's more on the sort of borderlands, on the periphery of a lot of the big empire building stuff. So this is the kind of stuff that I myself don't know much about. The sort of slow growth of Islam over the years, largely due to the influence of Islamic travelers and traders, and, you know, sort of mystics and, religious men traveling through these areas.
Around 1267, on the island of Sumatra, the Samudra Pasai Sultanate is founded, which becomes a center of Islamic learning and trade.
Interesting.
During this period, a new Sufi order emerges in the Sultanate of Rum. The Mevlevi order, who become famous for their whirling dervish ritual, seek spiritual enlightenment and gain steadily in popularity. The 14th century sees rival dynasties vying for control in the Muslim heartlands.
Yeah.
The Mamluks in Egypt.
And I will say, we sort of saw right in front of us Anatolia become what we sort of know it as, which is, we think of Anatolia and we think of it as sort of modern Turkey, essentially. We think of it as a region inhabited by Turks, specifically Muslim Turks. We sort of saw that process happen right in front of our eyes with conversion and, of course, settlement of these Turkic peoples from the east who are now settled in Anatolia and will continue to expand and further conquer the region. Of course, the Byzantines have already lost, the vast majority of their territory. They've got a bit longer to go, but not so much longer.
The Ilkhanate in Persia, and the many Turkic states of Anatolia,
Hey, the Ottomans.
of which one will soon emerge as perhaps the greatest Muslim empire of them all.
Whoa. Impressive. Maybe so. The Ottomans. I think there's maybe some competition for the greatest, but the Ottomans are up there.
The 1300s see the dawn of a mighty new Muslim empire. Osman I rules a small Turkic state in northwest Anatolia. Through a series of stunning conquests, his successors forged the Ottoman Empire.
I mean, we saw how quickly the early caliphate expanded. We've got a similar thing with the Ottomans. They also expand extremely rapidly. Now, in terms of being the greatest Muslim empire, I think they got to compete with the Abbasids, and that's a pretty tall order. I mean, the Islamic Golden Age, right? But the Ottomans conquer a lot of territory, bring in a Golden Age of their own, and they conquer territory that had never before been conquered by the Caliphate or other Muslim states. So they're definitely a competitor for that top spot.
In modern Turkey, the Ottomans later advance into the Balkans, conquering Bulgaria, Serbia, and Bosnia. Over time, many locals convert to Islam.
Yeah, and, the interesting thing about the Ottomans, compared to these other caliphates or Islamic states we've seen, is most of these Islamic states have been centered in the Middle East, perhaps Central Asia, West Asia, North Africa. The Ottomans, they are going to be centered right around Constantinople or Istanbul. It's a very Western-facing empire. They're very focused on Europe, on the Balkans, right? And of course, we had Islamic states out in Iberia, in Spain. So it's not the first time this has happened. And there was a lot of Muslim conversion throughout the Mediterranean in Sicily. But the Ottomans are pretty unique in how European facing they really are. They're really focused on the West, even though they will expand throughout the East and South as well.
Over time, many locals convert to Islam, attracted by economic benefits, legal privileges, and roles in Ottoman government.
Yeah, it's a similar story here that we've seen before, where not to say there was no forced conversion, that it never happened, but broadly, that was not a super popular thing. Generally, people of other religions, particularly Jews and Christians, were allowed to practice their own religion. And of course, within the Ottoman Empire, you had different types of Jews and Christians, Orthodox, Catholic, whatever. But you did see conversions over time, in part for religious reasons, but in part for practical reasons as well. Material benefits, in that if you converted, you'd be able to live, not as a second-class citizen. You wouldn't have to pay an extra tax. You'd get social benefits, economic benefits. You'd be able to fill roles in the Ottoman government. So slowly over time, you see conversion, especially at first among the elites who want to take advantage of the benefits being Muslim grants them, right? So that's the type of conversion we see, generally not one of forced conversion. If we're talking about absolute numbers, it's that slow sort of economic, really, pressure over time, or social pressure, you could say.
In 1453, Sultan Mehmet II conquers Constantinople, the former heart of the Eastern Roman Empire and of Orthodox Christianity, becomes an Islamic Ottoman capital. In Southeast Asia, Islam's influence continues to alter the religious landscape. The ruler of Malacca converts in 1414. He takes the title Sultan Iskandar Shah and makes Islam the state religion. Through commerce and alliances, the new sultanate helps Islam to spread further in the region. In 1478, the Demak Sultanate emerges as the first major Muslim state in Java.
Wow.
Meanwhile, in Europe, Granada, the last Muslim stronghold in Iberia, falls to Christian forces in 1492.
Yeah, so we get push and pull, right? Growth in some places, decline in others, right? We see essentially the Muslim presence pushed out of Iberia and through Reconquista, and not just like the Muslim states, but the Muslims themselves, right? So we've seen Christians and Jews continue to exist within Muslim states, but out here in Spain, the Christians, they basically tell the Muslims to get out. And there's a wave of both massacres, forced conversions, and then a lot of people fleeing for other states. And not just Muslims, but Jews as well. A lot of Jews are forced out. A lot of Jews are forced to convert to Christianity or to pretend to convert. And a lot of Jews actually flee to the Ottoman Empire, where they are at least allowed to live, right? Accepted a lot more than they were once the Christians reconquered Iberia. So once again, we see, Islam pulling back in some places, growing in others, which is pretty natural over time.
It marks the end of almost 8 centuries of Muslim rule in Spain.
It's crazy because, really due to the process of Reconquista and how much the Muslims were pushed out, you can still see, and I haven't been to Spain, but I understand if you go to southern Spain especially, there's still a lot of examples of Muslim influence on art, architecture, all these types of things. But a lot of the Muslim influence is pushed out and is sort of overwritten by Christian influence during this process and after the fact.
Spanish Muslims and Jews face forced conversion to Catholicism and ultimately expulsion.
Yeah.
In 1501, Shah Ismail I conquers Persia. He is the founder of the Safavid dynasty and declares Twelver Shi'ism the new state religion. It is why today Iran is an overwhelmingly Shia country.
And of course, that is a big part of the geopolitical situation out in the Middle East, which is that two of your big power players out there, probably the two biggest regional power players, are Saudi Arabia and Iran. Saudis are Sunni, vast majority, and the Iranians, vast majority, are Shiite, right? And so that causes tension, you could say sometimes.
In 1517, Ottoman Sultan Selim I conquers Egypt and the Hejaz.
Look at him go, my
He
God.
now controls Islam's two holiest sites, at Mecca and Medina, and declares himself the new caliph.
Yeah. Which is a big moment for the religious authority of the Ottoman Empire, right? Though I'll note that the Ottoman sultans, they never have the religious authority that the caliphs of old do, that no one really ever will.
Title will be held by Ottoman sultans for the next 400 years.
But they do have influence, I don't want to understate that.
In 1526, Babur, a descendant of Chinggis Khan, defeats the Delhi Sultanate. He lays the foundations of the Muslim Mughal Empire that will rule over much of India and its Hindu majority for the next 2 centuries.
Yeah.
But elsewhere, there are signs that Muslim power is beginning to wane. The Russians defeat the Khanates of Kazan, Astrakhan, and Sibir.
Yeah, we really, I mean, throughout the sort of midpoint, I mean, frankly, from the beginning of the video, what we've seen is almost constant Muslim expansion. And what I mean is expansion of Muslim states, so not necessarily conversions of people themselves, but in terms of Islamic states and empires, it's been almost constant expansion. But as we head into the late 1400s, into the 1500s, we see that stagnate and then really start to reverse in some places. I mean, Iberia was the first example, but we'll see a couple more to follow.
While Ottoman naval power suffers a first major check at the Battle of Lepanto. The high water mark of Ottoman expansion comes a century later at the failed siege of Vienna.
And by the way, that shows you that Lepanto was not the moment that everything turned around and the Ottomans were on the back foot. Oh no, they were still really powerful following that. They had this further century of really pushing at their own borders, trying to expand. And what we see here, we see the furthest extent of that. The Ottomans are still powerful, but at this point, that power will start to, it will stagnate and then start to decline, a decline that will continue over the course of a few hundred years. Oh, sorry.
From around this point on, the two great Muslim empires, the Ottoman and Mughal, find themselves increasingly challenged by internal divisions and external foes.
Well, and this is why, it's when I talk about the difference between the empires themselves and the people within the empires, it's why it's worth, looking at the map they've got here, where they've got these empires highlighted, but then also the general green just to represent sort of large Muslim populations, right? So we've got a difference here between wherever we have large Muslim populations and the sort of fate of these two big Muslim empires. The fate of the sort of religion itself and these two empires, of course, are related, but not necessarily always intertwined inextricably.
In 18th century Arabia, the reformist Wahhabi movement is born, characterized by suspicion of many traditional Islamic beliefs and practices. It acquires political influence through alliance with the Al Saud family, rulers of the first Saudi state.
Yeah, keep an eye on them.
The 19th century is an age of rampant European colonialism. Its targets include several Muslim countries, such as Algeria, Libya, Egypt, and Sudan.
Yeah, and this is where you see really the decline of Muslim political power, in that all of these great Muslim states are shrinking or falling over time. A lot of different Muslim majority regions are conquered by European states, so you see the decline of this political power over time. Now, of course, there's still, it doesn't mean that the religion itself necessarily enters decline. There is still a lot of Muslim populations around the world, But at this point, 1880, it's fair to say there's no longer any sort of great Muslim empire at this point, at least not compared to these European powers that are really rising up and conquering most of the world.
In several places, Islam becomes a powerful aspect of resistance to Christian colonizers. Colonialism also contributes to the birth of a new fundamentalist movement.
Yes.
Salafism, which seeks a return to the practices of the early Muslim community.
And once again, I talked about this much earlier in the video with the sort of emergence of Islam, but of course the religion is shaped by the culture and the time it emerges within. And so with different political circumstances, what do we see? Well, we see different branches or sects of Islam emerging, different practices becoming more popular, some practices becoming less popular. We see certain types of Islam become very tied up with resistance against colonialism. We see different types of Islam becoming tied up in certain political movements, right? So we see this shift over time. And of course, there's really incredible complexity here. I mean, we're talking about a global religion. We have been for a while. It's really spread around the world, of course, by 1880, since before then. And so there's really an incredible amount of diversity among the Islamic world at this point. It's sort of even difficult to generalize, same as with, say, the Christian world. Hard to generalize, but there's a lot going on during this time period.
Some of its followers will turn to armed jihad to challenge those it sees as occupiers and oppressors of Muslims.
The modern age. Here we go.
Following Ottoman defeat in World War I, Turkish leader Kemal Atatürk attempts to steer the country towards a more secular future.
Yeah, I mean, he's a big-time secularizer, right? He wants to move Turkey in many ways away from being a very religious society. He wants to make it more secular, more like a sort of modern secular nation state. Now, not all of that sticks, but it is a big change, right? And some of it does change the course of Turkey's history, in a big way, in fact.
As part of the process, in 1924, he dissolves the Ottoman Caliphate, a title Turkish rulers had claimed for 4 centuries. The political earthquakes of the 20th century, world wars, communist revolution, and decolonization profoundly alter the political map of Islam.
Yeah.
In August 1945, Indonesia declares independence from Dutch colonial rule. It becomes home to the world's largest Muslim population.
Yeah, I mean, makes sense. There's a lot of people out there in Indonesia.
The British Empire recedes. It leaves behind new divisions.
Yeah.
In 1947, the partition of India creates the Muslim majority states of West and East Pakistan, which later becomes Bangladesh.
I mean, what a disastrous decolonization. I mean, a lot of decolonization did not go very smoothly, but the partition of India might be the most disastrous of those decolonizations. Just leads to intense sectarian warfare, violence, civil conflict, just a really, really horrific event.
In 1948, the new Jewish state of Israel is founded in what had been British Mandate Palestine.
Founded with no controversy at all, and it all went smoothly from there, huh? Sheesh.
In 1979, the Iranian Revolution overthrows the Shah and establishes a Shia Islamic Republic, led by Ayatollah Khomeini.
And this, I'm not going to say it was the start of it, but this is really part of a sort of mid to late 20th century movement back towards Islamic fundamentalism, right? Away from a more secular way of doing things, which had been present under the Shah. Of course, he was a sort of Western puppet. You see, as a reaction to that in many ways, as a reaction, not just in Iran, but to a couple of different secular governments in the region, a turn towards Islamic fundamentalism. And I'd say we're very much still living in the aftermaths of this era of history, or we're still within this era of history in many ways.
In the late 20th century, historic colonial ties and economic migration lead to the growth of Muslim communities across Western Europe and North America. Muslims become an integral part of the Western cultural landscape. Just as on the global stage, dangerous new tensions emerge.
Uh-oh.
In 2001, a militant Islamic network called Al-Qaeda attacks the Twin Towers in New York. Suddenly, across much of the West, Islam is seen as a threat, vilified by some media and politicians. A gulf...
Yeah, more than some. Quite a lot, in fact. It was a pretty crazy era. Now, I myself was a little baby when this happened, only a few months old, right? So I'm not quite a post 9/11 baby, but of course I don't remember any of it, right? People, and anyone younger than me, they were born after 9/11, which I know is crazy to some people. You've got a lot of us who are full-grown adults today who grew up in the aftermath, but did not remember the event or the really immediate aftermath. But of course, it led to this era of the War on Terror, a lot of demonization of Islam and Muslims in the West, and a lot of this warfare that was to follow, right? And all of this is what leads up in many ways to our current political moment.
Grows between how most Muslims see their faith and some perceptions in the West. Tensions between religious and political extremists persist in the West to the present day. There have also been serious conflicts between the state and some Muslim groups in Russia,
Yeah.
Myanmar,
Yes. I
ongoing
mean, as they pointed out, more than a conflict, a genocide.
persecution in China, and an escalating conflict in Israel-Palestine.
Yeah, another genocide.
These are not the first crises in Islam's 1400-year history, a period in which the religion has shown incredible endurance and adaptability.
Well, hey, really, any religion that can spread this far must be pretty durable and adaptable, right?
Made by traders and conquerors, it has traveled to distant lands, from Iberia to Indonesia, uniting peoples and inspiring the rise of great civilizations. Whether seen through the lens of faith or history, the rise of Islam is one of the most remarkable journeys in our collective past.
Oh, yeah.
Its legacy lives on in the 1.9 billion Muslims on Earth today.
That's a lot of people.
Do you enjoy Epic History videos
Yes.
and want to support our work? Then make sure you check out our Patreon page for new episodes, production updates.
There you go. I'll have their video linked down below, so you can go and check them out. You can go and check out their Patreon, give them a like, all that good stuff. We want to show support to Epic History for making these fantastic videos. I've also got my Patreon link down below if you're interested in exclusive reaction content. Yeah, that was a fascinating video, right? As I said, whether you look at it through the lens of faith or history, a fascinating journey. Of course, I look at this from a historical perspective, but even so, just a fascinating story about the origins and expansion of this global religion, the second most popular religion today, and I think probably will be the first most popular at some point. I mean, I don't have the stats off the top of my head, but I believe Islam is spreading faster than Christianity is. Maybe not, I don't know. Either way, it doesn't matter if you're one or two, right? It's one of the most popular global religions in the world, right? So it's really fascinating to see the origins and expansion over time. A really interesting story. I certainly enjoyed this one. I think Epic History always does a fantastic job with these videos. I enjoyed the Christianity one. This one was good as well. It's interesting to see them take on one of these sort of broader global topics, in that oftentimes they're more focused on a particular event. They tell a more sort of narrative history, though we've seen them do broader videos before. I like something like this, which is more a survey of a much larger story over the span of, well, in this case, thousands or at least more than 1,000 years, right? So fascinating stuff. Hope you guys enjoyed this one. If you did, you can leave a like, subscribe. Once again, you can check out my Patreon, which is linked down below. Now, I hope you guys are all having a fantastic day today, and I will see you all again next time. Goodbye.